Whether you're a seasoned manager with hundreds of job interviews under your belt, or you're conducting job interviews for the first time, understanding the legal aspects of interviewing is critical. Job interviews are full of potential legal landmines, and if you aren't careful, one wrong comment or question could generate legal trouble for you and your organization. In 1964, federal and local government agencies began enacting laws that protect employees from workplace discrimination, including discrimination in hiring practices. A person cannot be denied employment because of race, color, national origin, religion, gender, sexual orientation, marital or family status, pregnancy, disability, genetic information, or age for employees 40 and over. Therefore, questions on these topics are strictly off limits in an interview or on an application. In addition, some questions about arrest records, personal appearance, drug or alcohol use, club affiliations, organizational membership, home ownership, and finances should be avoided as well. So what can you ask? You can ask questions directly related to the essential functions of the job that you're hiring for. However, even these questions can be tricky. So let's go over each of these topics individually and discuss what you can and cannot say.
That's an interesting accent. Were you born in the United States?
So are you Pakistani or Indian?
Is English your first language?
Questions related to the topics of race, color, and national origin are strictly off limits. It's illegal to consider any of these factors when making a hiring decision. Therefore, asking questions about these protected characteristics can do nothing but put you in legal jeopardy, and you should avoid them entirely. However, there are job-related instances where you may need to know facts related to national origin, such as immigration status and language fluency. In these cases, the important thing to do is keep it job-related. Ask the questions like this.
If hired, will you be able to provide proof of the legal right to work in the United States?
In this job, you'll communicate with customers from many different countries. What languages can you speak fluently?
In both of these instances, the interviewer kept questions job-related and asked for legitimate information relative to the position. There was no need to broach the dangerous topic of national origin.
What holidays do you celebrate?
Will your religious beliefs always require you to wear a turban?
A candidate's religious beliefs and practices are irrelevant when making a hiring decision, and therefore any questions pertaining to religion should never be asked. In almost all cases, employers must make exceptions to company dress and grooming policies to accommodate religious practices. Asking a question related to these practices could imply bias if the candidate is not hired. If you need to know whether a candidate's available to work during religious holidays and on weekends, it's much better to simply ask without making any reference to religion whatsoever.
This job requires that employees work on the weekend. Is there any reason you might be unavailable to work on Saturdays and Sundays?
Organizations such as churches, religious schools, and religious associations, whose primary focus or mission is religious in nature, are exempted from this rule and may ask questions about a candidate's religion. While the gender of a candidate is clear in most cases, you should refrain from asking any gender identification questions if you're unsure. The EEOC has held that discrimination against an individual because of gender identity or sexual orientation falls into the category of sex discrimination. Therefore, any questions referencing these topics could lead directly to a discrimination lawsuit and should be avoided entirely. Also, be very careful not to imply that a position is gender-specific unless there's a compelling reason for the job to be given to one sex or the other, such as a locker room attendant.
Usually, we have men do this job. Are you sure you're strong enough to lift 40 pounds?
This question strongly suggests that the interviewer has a bias against women when hiring for this particular job. Because gender is irrelevant for most jobs, it's much better to keep it job-related and ask the question like this.
This job requires lifting boxes that weigh 40 pounds. Is there any reason that you would not be able to lift this much weight?
By keeping the question about specific skills and by asking it of every candidate, male or female, you'll help protect yourself from liability.
Will your spouse mind if you're required to work long hours?
Do you plan on having more children?
Are you having any complications with your pregnancy?
Questions about marital status, family status, or pregnancy should never be asked in an interview. These personal facts about a candidate are irrelevant and can't be used as part of the hiring decision. Therefore, asking questions about them will almost always imply bias. However, sometimes there are legitimate reasons to know about a person's family. For instance, concerns about conflict of interest. If you need to ask a family-related question, make sure it's job-related and limit the scope to the information you need to know.
Our company requires that we check for conflict of interest issues. Do you have any relatives employed by this company or by one of our competitors?
Do you have any physical disabilities or illnesses?
Have you ever filed a workers' compensation claim?
Questions about disabilities, illnesses, or workers' compensation claims are never allowed in a job interview. However, you may ask a candidate if they can physically perform the essential functions of the job.
Will you be able to perform all of the essential functions of this job with or without reasonable accommodation?
Be sure you ask every candidate the same question, not just candidates you believe are disabled. A reasonable accommodation is a change to the work environment or to the normal way things are done that is not an undue hardship on the employer as defined by the ADA. Most accommodations are not expensive or difficult and are generally required to be implemented if needed. You may ask a candidate to perform a job duty. However, you must ask every job candidate who interviews for the position to perform the same demonstration, not just the candidates you suspect are disabled. Also, the interviewing location must be accessible to all candidates, so there's an equal opportunity for everyone to interview for the position.
Is there a history of cancer in your family?
Job applicants are protected from discrimination based on their family medical history and from information gathered in genetic tests. Questions related to these topics should be avoided altogether in the interviewing and hiring process.
When do you plan on retiring?
You didn't grow up working with computers, did you?
Age is another legal landmine for interviewers. Employers cannot discriminate against candidates who are 40 years of age or older. Therefore, questions that might pinpoint a candidate's age should be avoided entirely. If you're concerned that the candidate may not stay with the company very long, simply ask about the future in a job-related way.
What are your long-term career goals?
Keep in mind that if you ask a question like this, it should be asked of every candidate you interview, not just the candidates over 40.
Are you a member of any clubs?
It's very dangerous to ask if a job applicant is a member of any organization, club, or society, because membership often indicates an applicant's race, sex, national origin, disability status, age, religion, color, or ancestry. And this is information you can't use when making a hiring decision. So the job interviewer should avoid these questions entirely. If a candidate volunteers this information, or if it's included in a resume, do not ask follow-up questions and do not reference it in your notes.
Do you drink alcohol socially?
Have you ever been treated for an addiction?
Questions regarding past treatment for addiction or current use of legal prescription drugs and alcohol are not legally permissible, and this information cannot be used when making hiring decisions. However, you can ask the candidate if they currently engage in illegal drug use.
You're a really big guy. How much do you weigh?
Unless you can prove that a candidate's height and weight are relevant to job performance, they should not be required on an application or asked about during a job interview. In addition, you should make no mention about a candidate's personal appearance in your notes. Also, it's illegal to ask for a photograph of a candidate prior to a job interview. It is legal, however, to take a picture of the employee after they've been hired for identification purposes. While military service is generally seen as a positive attribute in a prospective candidate, there are some important legal pitfalls to avoid.
Were you honorably discharged from the Navy?
Are you a member of the National Guard or Reserves?
Asking about a candidate's discharge from the military is always off limits in an interview. In addition, asking a candidate if they're in the National Guard or Reserves could imply bias if they're not hired for the position. It may be inconvenient when an employee leaves to fulfill a military obligation. However, this information cannot be used to disqualify an applicant. Relevant, job-specific questions about the candidate's experience in the military are legal to ask in an interview.
What job skills did you learn during your service in the Coast Guard?
Federal law does not prohibit employers from asking about financial information, such as credit history and bankruptcy, if they're relevant to the position. However, employers need to tread lightly on the subject. Job applicants should be informed if their credit history will be examined, and you should follow all applicable laws related to personal credit information, as defined by the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Employers should be careful that financial information is not used to exclude one particular race, religion, or nationality. In addition, exceptions must be made for persons who do not meet financial criteria due to a disability.
Do you live close to here?
Do you own your home or do you rent?
You can never ask where a candidate lives or whether they rent or own a home. If you need to know about the candidate's ability to get to work, keep it job-related.
If you are hired, will you be able to arrive at work by 8 a.m.?
This job requires that you be on call several days a week. If hired, would you be able to arrive at work within 30 minutes of being called in?
There certainly is a lot to remember, and it's understandable if your head is spinning. However, there is a simple way to make sure you never ask questions that could put you in legal jeopardy, and that is by asking pre-planned interviewing questions. Preparing for a job interview is the most critical part of the process. An up-to-date and accurate job description must be maintained that explicitly spells out the essential and non-essential functions of the job. The essential functions are the core functions and responsibilities of the position. In other words, the reason the job exists. Essential functions should be performed in practice and not just on paper. Make sure that the functions in your job description are actually performed on the job. Using the essential functions, develop a list of the skills that are necessary for the position, and then develop your interviewing questions around those skills. Having a list of pre-planned interviewing questions that focus solely on finding out if the candidate has the skills needed for the position will help you avoid asking questions that are irrelevant and could be construed as discriminatory. All you need to do is stick to the script. Sometimes you'll be completely prepared with your pre-planned script of interviewing questions, and suddenly the candidate will volunteer information that you don't need or want to know.
I'm so happy to be interviewing for this position. With 6 kids and a husband in the military, I just need to get out of the house.
The best thing to do in this situation is to ignore the statement with tact. Don't write anything about it in your notes, and do not ask any follow-up questions about it. You may not be able to control what the candidate tells you. However, you can control how you use this information. Interviewing notes can be subpoenaed in a discrimination lawsuit, and any notation about a candidate's protected characteristics, like race or religion, could be used to demonstrate bias. A good rule of thumb is to include only job-specific information in your notes. If the information cannot be legally used to make a hiring decision, it should be left out. Interviewers need to be very careful about using some of the information found on resumes. For instance, a candidate might list a club or society membership that reveals a characteristic such as race or religion. If this occurs, do not follow up on this information in the interview or use this information as part of your hiring decision. The same is true with social media. It's become common practice to research candidates' social media accounts as part of the applicant review process. It's very easy to learn information about a candidate, such as race or gender, that would not have been cited in a resume, as well as information such as religion, national origin, or disability, that would not have been discovered in an interview. The courts will assume that you know this information the moment you access a social media account. This information should not be addressed during an interview, nor used in the selection process. If you check social media information for one candidate, it must be done for every candidate. Consistency in the interviewing process will ensure that everyone receives equal treatment and opportunity. Once you have your pre-planned interviewing questions written, it's imperative that you stick to the script. Every candidate that you interview should be asked the same questions. In addition, every interview should be roughly the same length. If, for example, it's discovered that white candidates receive on average more time in their interviews than persons of color, your organization would open itself up to a discrimination lawsuit. Be careful you do not oversell the position. Promising a candidate pay raises or future promotions that aren't part of the employment contract could come back to bite you in the form of a lawsuit when the employee does not receive what you promised. The interviewing process is full of legal hazards, but you can take reliable steps to protect yourself. By pre-planning interviewing questions to focus on job-related skills only, and by carefully checking that none of your questions imply bias, you can protect your organization and yourself from potential lawsuits, while increasing your chances of finding the best candidate possible.